Jodian, you have been following Carib Cement. They recently made a dividend declaration. And just before we look at Carib Cement, Jodian, are you invested in Carib Cement?
Well, search for investments as a investment manager would be managing equity funds, and so one or more of those funds would actually have exposure to Carib Cement.
All right. So, all right. They recently declared a dividend of just over $2 per share. What is going on with Carib Cement? What's the latest there?
Sure. So I really wanted to look at Carib Cement because this would have been one of Search for Investment's top picks for 2025. And as we know, Carib Cement is a key player in Jamaica's manufacturing sector, particularly specializing in the production and sale of cement. And among the factors that would have been in our outlook for Carib Cement at the start of the year was the ongoing capacity expansion, which is aimed at really fulfilling the 100% needs locally as well as to position themselves for export in CARICOM. This really puts Carib Cement in a position to capitalize on what it is that we're seeing as rising regional construction demand and pretty much reinforce their presence in the market. I think just to talk back on what your guest would have said earlier when he spoke on the construction segment or the construction market locally, we'd have pointed to the fact that there has been a bit of a decline over the past year, probably 2 years in construction. But since then, we have started to see somewhat of an uptick in demand for construction. What it is that is also generally important is that when we look at companies, we also want to look at their plans to diversify revenue. And so the plan for Carib Cement to do an expansion so that they can do more exports in the CARICOM region would have actually been something that would have been very good. As well as we always point out that it is always important for investors to take positions at points where things a bit sluggish as companies are really preparing for a turnaround. So if it is that we would have been looking at somewhat of a downturn in construction and now we're starting to see a pickup, it's always good to consider when as investors, if it is that we think, is this downturn going to be something that is continuous or is there likely to be a turnaround? Because at that point, you could also be taking some positions when there's a bit of a price dip. Also for Carib Cement is that we saw some improvement in the margins for last year. And that would have been really pointing to the fact that there is effective cost management in the company as well as reduced financial expenses. So we'd have noted that earnings per share would have increased year over year. And I think another thing, if you're somebody who has been in the market for quite a bit of time, we'd have known that Carib Cement really had a lot of interest generating debt. And they were able to reduce that. And that would have been a big part of the company in terms of the turnaround, not necessarily in the past year or two, but generally over a long period of time. So when we look at that debt to equity ratio in 2020, it was over 100%. And we have seen that steadily come down to less than 50% as at 2024. And so these are some of the key factors in which it is that would have made Carib Cement one of our main companies that we'd have recommended at the start of the year. In terms of what we'd have seen so far for Q1 is that they're continuing to be on that upward movement. So revenues would have grown, we'd have seen increase in terms of their operating earnings, as well as EPS would have also increased. And then just to touch, as you mentioned, there was a dividend declaration of $2 and almost 10 cents per share, and that would be payable on September 16, 2025. And that now is a company that has dividend yield of around 2.5%. So while our recommendation was largely driven around the expansion plans and the improvement in financial performance, I think that for investors, the dividend would have also played a part while it is that you wait for any sort of expected capital appreciation.
Yeah, it's good to see Carib Cement paying paying dividends, given their history with dividends. Good to see that. What was I going to ask? What can we expect from them going forward, given where we're seeing the industry now?
Well, I think there is still demand. I think we'd note that probably in the past month, I just tag on what your guests have said, is that there has been a little bit of a ramp up in terms of some construction activities. But the positioning in terms of the expansion that they're planning is really where the key is. In the fact that for next year, for 2025, 2026, moving forward, that they'll be able to do more regional exports. And so that is something that is really hinging in terms of the continued growth that we'll see for them.